The Imperial Navy was one of the largest military forces the galaxy has ever seen, and while we often see small segments of it on screen from time to time, it's not often discussed how they organized their fleet, so today I want to talk about what a normal Imperial Navy fleet would have looked like. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So the Imperial Navy was a gargantuan force, 25,000 Star Destroyers plus countless support ships and other combat vessels that patrolled the galaxy for over 2 decades, and their impact stretches well beyond the end of the Galactic Empire with their influence on later factions. So today I want to discuss what Imperial Navy fleets would have actually looked like, and what the people of the galaxy would have seen when the Imperial Navy visited their systems. Now, I want to make a clear point here that I'm not really discussing the ship types as individual vessels, but instead the way the Empire would have composed these fleets. Now, let's start with the smallest of the fleets, these light patrol fleets. We see these a lot in shows like Star Wars Rebels. These generally consist of a handful of Architons-class light cruisers. These would have been deployed to systems where the Empire needed a show of force, but not necessarily an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. Keep in mind, while the Empire did have a lot of ISDs, they weren't still able to go everywhere because, while there was 25,000 ISDs, there was far more planets in the galaxy than that. So the Empire needed a softer power projection element that could be deployed when the ISDs were needed elsewhere, or when the situation didn't need such a drastically large warship. But these fleets didn't consist of Architons-class cruisers alone. They were often supported by other small vessels, most notably Gazanti-class freighters, and I refuse to call them cruisers, they are freighters. The Gazantis could carry small fighter complements, which would allow these small patrol fleets and sort of small enforcement fleets to carry a small complement of TIE fighters. But when they needed a larger complement of TIE fighters, they would likely use a carrier-based group, like what we see over Ryloth during the occupation of Ryloth, a single Quasar-Fire-class light carrier supported by a number of Architons-class light cruisers, usually 1 or 2 cruisers. And this formation would have had a few Gazantis for logistical roles, as they also serve as excellent light transports. This kind of formation excels at power projection to the surface of a planet, being able to deploy flights of TIE fighters, and notably TIE bombers, to carry out strikes against potential rebel targets. This is exactly what we see that fleet over Ryloth doing, and it's remarkably effective. But before we talk about the big fleets that involve things like the ISDs, I want to discuss one more very small fleet that we do see a couple times in Rebels, and that's transport fleets. These tiny fleets often consist of mainly just Gazanti-class freighters, usually with a small complement of TIE fighters, but more or less it's 2 or 3 of these freighters transporting valuable cargo from one place to another. Now, exceptionally valuable cargo will get a larger ship, but most military cargoes would just get Gazantis, and often, by the way, these ships would operate on their own, be it a Gazanti-class freighter or an Architons-class light cruiser. The one exception being the Quasar-Fire-class carriers, which were very defenseless on their own, lacking any turbo lasers themselves. Now, I know why you're all here. Let's talk about Imperial-class Star Destroyers. The ISDs themselves were not as common as one would think. They actually usually operated in small groups of 2 to 3, serving as the command vessels of sector fleets or regional fleets or defense fleets on worlds that are either strategically important or vulnerable to rebel attack. If a world became particularly rebellious and was proving to be a real thorn in the side of the Empire, an ISD being present not only represented a huge military asset in the area that the Empire could employ from both an orbital bombardment standpoint and a sort of fighter standpoint for using the Star Destroyer as a carrier, but it also represented a massive morale tool, as it could be used to sort of strike fear into the hearts of a planet, seeing a vessel that big in orbit. And like I said, ISDs rarely work alone. They usually work in small groups, 2 or 3 when we're looking at a small response fleet. But then we talk about the much larger sector fleets. These would have 7 or 8 Imperial-class Star Destroyers, either ISD-1s or ISD-2s, and they'd be supported by a number of smaller vessels. These would be things like Architons-class light cruisers for fire support, and even a few Quasar-class carriers for, additional fighter complements. In very specific situations, these fleets might also have things like interdictor cruisers on hand to prevent rebel escapes. Now, these are usually fleets that are specifically tasked with assaulting rebel bases with the idea of wanting to keep the rebels contained. And lastly, we have the few specialized fleets that we see throughout galactic history. The most famous being Death Squadron, which is under the command of Darth Vader during The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. This was commanded by a single Executor-class Star Destroyer, and then the rest of the fleet consisted of about 15 Imperial-class Star Destroyers of both ISD-1 and ISD-2 classifications. Now, this fleet is very different from other fleets we see in the Imperial Navy. It's much larger and more capable, and it lacks a lot of the smaller vessels we see supporting other Imperial Navy operations. There's no sign of any Architons-class light cruisers, Gazantes, or Quasar Fire carriers, and while interdictors would have been very useful at the Battle of Hoth, they weren't present there and instead were only present at the Battle of Endor. Now, there were other fleets like Death Squadron. It's likely that Emperor Palpatine had a personal fleet of similar caliber to escort him around the galaxy during the later days of the Galactic Civil War, but they were a relative rarity, and most Imperial fleets consisted of a handful of ISDs at most. But the massive Imperial Navy had to be broken up into smaller fleets in some way, shape, or form. After all, you can't solve every problem by just throwing ISDs at it. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer was a fascinating ship, though, and I do want to talk about it more, and that's why next month I have a series planned called ISD-December, where I intend to do a series of videos on the anatomy of an Imperial-class Star Destroyer, talking about various elements around the ship and how this massive and iconic vessel would have been utilized, constructed, and employed by the Galactic Empire. Well, next month we're focusing a lot on the ISD. If you want to learn about some of the other ships in the Imperial Navy, I'll leave a link up here to a video I made a while back on the Architons, the Gazanti, and the Quasar Fire, the small ships of the Imperial Navy that often get overshadowed by the massive and capable Imperial-class Star Destroyer. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments if there's a specific part of an Imperial-class Star Destroyer you'd like to know about. Is there something on the vessel that interests you that you'd like to see talked about in more detail? Let me know down below. And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars or anywhere else in science fiction, you can also leave that down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.